Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the CUBO Winter Conference 2021. Thank you to those of you who have made the effort to come back from lunch break. It's much appreciated. So for this session, which is entitled Growth and Future Opportunity, delighted that we've got Mike Adams, who's the Principal Insight Consultant from UCAS, joining us. So welcome, Mike. Thank you very much. Before we enter into the detail of the session, so a little bit of housekeeping from me. So again, for those who've been to a number of sessions this morning, I apologise, I sound like a stuck record at this point, but huge thanks to all of our partners for supporting the CUBO Winter Conference, to Campus Life, to Co-op Franchise, to Quadient, to WES, to StarRes and Unite Students. Who really can't deliver these sorts of events without the support of our partners. It's very much appreciated. The session is being recorded, so it will be available and circulated after the event for anybody that didn't get the opportunity to attend. We're running a Twitter competition over the course of the day, so with the prize and the sort of winning tweeter to be announced at about 4:15 later this afternoon. So for all of you who are much more proficient at Twitter than I am, please utilize the hashtag CUBO Winter 2021. So that's hashtag CUBO Winter 2021. I would encourage Q&A or Q rather at various points throughout the session. So please again utilize the live Q&A feed, which is on the panel on the right hand side, or it should be if your panel looks like mine. So any questions for Mike as the session progresses, please add them into there. Something I haven't mentioned, but I'm going to now. I was supposed to talk about benchmarking. So if you haven't submitted and completed your benchmarking activity yet, please do so and give it some attention over the course of the next couple of weeks. The insight for us is really useful as a members organisation. So without further ado, at this point in time, I'm going to hand over to my WES colleagues and ask them to play Mike's pre-record, and then Mike and I will both pop up towards the end of the session for Q&A.
Hello and welcome to the UCAS session, Growth and Future Predictions. We saw at day 28 this year numbers that indicate that the health of the HE sector continues robustly. 682,010 total applications, over 500,000 placed applicants, and some almost 50,000 people placed via clearing and direct clearing in total. And actually what this shows is that the sector itself is in good health and growing in terms of demand. But within these numbers, there's a key audience that we need to consider, which is the 18-year-olds. We saw an increased number of 18-year-old applicants last cycle, an increase of 4.8% to almost 300,000. And if you look on the graph indicated by the light blue line here, you can see they rise as correspondingly other groups, the 19 to 24-year-olds, actually declined by almost 19,000 when compared to 2020. So as more students are finding their way into higher education at 18, we see a corresponding change in those that have deferred or decided to leave it slightly later. And at the same time, as the number of 18-year-old applicants has actually risen, it's worth looking at the state or the numbers of the 18-year-olds in the UK population as a whole. Now, some of you may have seen this slide before. It's the mountainside, as I've referred to it, the green line that shows the population estimate for the number of 18-year-olds. And since 2020, that's rising, and it's rising steadily here until 2025. The red line represents actually the application rate of 18-year-olds, which crossed over in 2018 and continues to rise now, as our predictions show, toward a high point in 2025. So we're going to see more 18-year-olds within the population, and we anticipate a rising number of those 18-year-olds applying to university. So while these numbers are good, when we look at it overall, we can see that their proportion increases, so does actually the number of applicants from international, non-EU, and from UK, all applicants. On the left here, you can see the chart that shows the rise in non-EU and non-UK applicants. And on the right-hand side, the forecast for UK applicants with a slightly wider margin for error. But our prediction is that these numbers will only increase. So we see for the sector a large number of applications in the future, an increasing number from 18-year-olds, and an increasing number as a total. But when it comes to the division of those applications, regionally, things are unbalanced. For a start, we have seen the fall in EU applicants that many foresaw. And as you can see here, the green line on the chart shows where the EU, excluding the UK, the June applicants by domicile at the June deadline actually has fallen significantly this year. But the non-EU, the international applicants, continues to rise. So we can see that the makeup of the number of applicants for HE in the UK actually changes somewhat, but it's only going in one direction. If we look at the regions, this chart that looks rather like a wiring diagram gone slightly haywire actually replicates what we've just seen in terms of the number of 18-year-olds, but in this case it shows it by region. In each region of the UK, by degree, there's a rise in the forecast numbers of 18-year-olds. And as an example only, you can see here the forecast number of 18-year-olds for the West Midlands, rising from 69,600 in 2016 up to a prediction of 77,500 in 2026. So there are more 18-year-olds in every part of the UK, and they are applying increasingly to higher education. When we looked at the June deadline, we could begin to see this. We can see that in every region there's a steady or a small increase in the number of applicants. Again, looking at the West Midlands just as an example, you can see in the bottom right hand corner the change that we've witnessed there from 2019 to 2021. And we perceive that that's going to continue. However, the distribution of these applicants is not even. Because they're from the West Midlands, it doesn't mean that they're going to now study in the West Midlands. And indeed, the internal migration patterns show quite a stark change. When we look at where applicants are applying, we're beginning to see a shift toward the southwest and the northwest. In essence, people are moving more to the west and less to the east. And that's a migration internally to within each UK region. The chart on the right shows the proportion of acceptances that were placed in their home region. There's been a change. COVID may well have affected 18-year-olds and their outlook on university, but one thing it seems to have confirmed is that they would like to move somewhere else to study. So all regions of the UK, we believe, are going to see a sustained increase in the number of 18-year-olds that apply, but that's not an even distribution across the UK. Strong university and city brands continue to pull students, and we're beginning to see that that's more regionalised now, stronger in towards the southwest and the west of the country, less so to the east. COVID didn't mean that more students wanted to stay close to home. There's an increasing desire to travel and move out of the region. So the picture for accommodation starts to take on a slightly different slant based upon where you actually are. And finding accommodation also changed. Every aspect of the student experience was challenged by COVID, and not least that process of actually selecting accommodation in the first place. Something that's traditionally part of open days suddenly became far more challenging and far more difficult. Actually, students in accommodation faced different challenges to those that were looking for their accommodation for the first time. The whole sector was shaken slightly by the nature not only of COVID, but of the requirements that that placed upon the sector to be able to deal with the changes that the students themselves were living through, and the sector actually had to start to find solutions for. So COVID-19 instantly led to this idea and this discussion that everyone would wish to stay close to home. Actually, when we looked at it, we can see that if we take a sample report that we carried out looking at accommodation in a survey, those students that already changed their minds so they could stay at home were right the way through to those that thought it was somewhat likely that they might find somewhere so they could stay close to home, only came to some 16%. Not likely, not at all likely, with higher percentages. Again, reflecting what we see in terms of our forecast for students beginning to wish to travel out of region. So COVID was definitely an influencing fact, But it didn't mean that suddenly the entire student population didn't want to move out of their region. The search went viral. Actually, the research was carried out online. The virtual searches were being carried out to 2, 3, 4 to 10. Many more properties were being looked at, and it was being looked at online. There was no way for many students to actually go and experience the accommodation in in the same way that their forebears had. And that made things slightly more difficult because now accommodation was being selected solely upon how it was being presented. What they wanted, however, actually remained exactly the same. The number always surprises me, but they all wanted an ensuite bathroom within uni halls. That's what the main consideration was for these first year students. Again, there was variation within that, but what put them off was cost, location, and actually, yes, the condition of that bathroom, cleanliness generally. The students were conscious they were needing to make decisions about where they were going to go, and they were only going to be able to do that looking at images, possibly also virtual tours. It didn't change what they wanted, and we estimate that the number of beds in the PBSA sector is going to rise to meet the rise that we forecast in the number of 18-year-olds and the number of students who wish to enter higher education um, in the future. And it rises quite considerably for private and university PBSA. Applicants versus placed, we believe the total placed and the total applicants, as those numbers rise, actually the total beds and placed applicants, the beds will keep pace with that, but it begins to narrow. So we estimate that there will be the beds in the future for the increase of the number of students that we predict to be entering into higher education. The factors and the qualities that they were looking for when they were actually searching for their accommodation during COVID hadn't changed particularly. They still knew that location was important. They still knew the type of accommodation they wanted. They just weren't able to actually go and see it physically. And the experience that the students have of their accommodation is clearly vital, not only for them, but how they then reflect upon that socially. And the idea of a shared network and the way that students now increasingly find out about universities and courses and accommodation spreads that news and that view faster than ever. So it's important to recognize what that experience is and what influences them in terms of how happy they are with their accommodation. Now, the work we've done with Knight Frank and the accommodation survey over the last few years, shown here, some of it, actually indicates the percentage of students who are in a privately PBSA as opposed to university operated PBSA, the lighter colour. And again, we can see that it's the idea of the social environment which is important. Living with other students, the location, the number of bedrooms, and the option to live in there maybe for more than 1 year, which for those in the privately rented sector is more important than those in the university PBSA. So the influences are very much around connection, around sociability, atmosphere, hard to pin down, but really very important for those coming into the university. And again, perhaps slightly coloured by the fact that that's what they were desperate to find after living at home with COVID restrictions. The dissatisfaction remains the same as the surveys we've done in the past. It's about value for money. The proportion of money that the students spend from that they have available going on accommodation in the first year is still really very high. And for those in privately operated PBSA, a lack of value for money and problems with the building actually left them dissatisfied. For those in university operated accommodation, it was actually about noise or, again, a perceived lack of value for money. Affordable living costs come up and again, specifically in terms of the well being for those students. Their experience is obviously very much based around how they're living and the quality of that life, and their well being is impacted by that and being able to live and manage living where they wish. The standard of accommodation fed directly into this. So, how good the accommodation is, how much it costs, how easy it is for students to make connections, its location in terms of how close it is to university, all remain key themes we've seen before. What would they pay for? Well, we did some work previously and determined that yes, it was indeed fast Wi-Fi, and that's not changing. We shouldn't be surprised, perhaps, as we all became more and more used to the impact of technology and how that's got us through the early stages of the COVID pandemic. But students would pay a premium for fast Wi-Fi. It's something we've seen before. These are the students who've grown up entirely as digital natives, and for them, having fast and easy access to the internet is actually the way that they live their lives, as we'll see in a moment. And so the fact that they'll pay a premium for it shouldn't in any way surprise us. Better views from the bedrooms aren't so important, however, at only 30%. So COVID-19, their experience varied widely depending on the type of accommodation that they lived in, with almost 70% of those actually living in a PBSA feeling positive about their provider's response, but only 25% of those in the private rented sector did. Clearly, the sense of what was being offered and how the sector came to understand the needs of those students and meet them, we're seeing as feedback. 93% who indicated that they'd actually had a response from their provider to COVID-19 in a positive way said they would recommend their accommodation. We did see the images on the television of students in halls of accommodation clearly feeling hard done by. And yet, it seems that when they reflected on this, if the providers had stepped up and actually delivered services to make their lives easier, they didn't see that as a problem. On the contrary, they saw that they were being supported. So there was not a one size fits all. The concept of COVID suddenly creating an environment where student halls were hateful places to be doesn't seem to be borne out by their reported experience. Now, it's impossible to be involved in higher education and not be aware of the fact that there is reform in the air. And it isn't my role, particularly, to talk about reform today in any way. But in terms of the reform that's being discussed and being considered, the idea of changing the process of application would fundamentally change the way in which the accommodation sector would need to be able to respond to that. So the headlines are shouting of reform, and there are essentially three broad potential changes to the current system. A move toward a post qualification decision. Students decide which offer they wish to accept once they've had their results. Post qualification offers, where universities make offers after they students have their results and they then decide which to accept, and then post qualification applications, where students apply after they have their results and they receive their offers and then decide which to accept. So as you can see on the chart, there's a trade-off between when you decide and when you apply and how the systems work. And it's really a process which is being considered and discussed and under review. So this is simply to serve as a small guide, because the impact that this would have on accommodation could be significant, because operational consequences, if accommodation providers have to deal with a PQA system, means that the booking cycle itself, the visiting, the ability to arrange and organize accommodation will all become suddenly telescoped into a really short time period. There's going to need to be change across the sector to understand this if PQA or any other form of change to the application system is introduced. It's something for the future, and we don't yet know what the shape is, but it's certainly there to be considered. So I've talked a little bit about accommodation. I've talked about what we see in terms of numbers. I've talked about COVID-19 and how the students themselves had to deal with that environment. But there is an overriding sense that for all students, and particularly those that have been through the pandemic as first or even second years, there is now very much a connected culture. It's a nice quote from a student report that we've had, that for most people, I.e. most students, they're choosing their uni for the vibe and the course. It's nice to see that it's still about the idea that university is providing that experience as well, hopefully, as that quality education. But when we think about, or we look at what students do in their spare time, it hasn't hugely changed. It's still about music and it's about films. And I'm pleased to say it's also about chatting to others and meeting them. Those connections, those shared experiences. Those are the things that are still creating the value in the university experience. And whilst the number of those in that we surveyed in 2020 had fallen in terms of having a part-time job from 2019, it's still important for 26% of those students. In terms of the media that they're using, 94% of first years use at least one entertainment service. The big names predominate. But it means that this idea of culture and connected culture is still spreading far. And it's the reason why those students would pay more for a fast Wi Fi service, because their lives and their social lives are very much built around the use of these media. And social media, ups and downs as always, but still predominantly visual and connective. COVID was a challenge for everybody and remains so. But COVID also demonstrated the importance of connections and remaining in touch. And what did most first years use social media for? Chatting to family and friends. It was as important in 2020 as it was in 2019, and video chat was more popular than ever. So perhaps those students that had to spend their time in accommodation halls or in other PBSA actually found that they could manage COVID because they had the connectivity to be able to do so. If there was one social media site first you'd use, well, whilst it would be Instagram at the top, WhatsApp had increased. Again, the idea of being able to stay in touch and be able to communicate and use systems to do so indicates that the first years themselves were able to manage COVID. It had an impact, but we can see it hasn't blunted the desire to move away from home. It hasn't blunted the desire to go to university. It's just increased the requirement to be able to make that connectivity between home and the new environment, as well as within that new environment. So we see social media sites which first years are using, TikTok and Zoom, are more popular than Twitter amongst this cohort, the ever changing face of social media. But it's interesting that almost 80% of students do subscribe to at least one subscription service. If we're beginning to think about these themes emerging, then perhaps it's time for PBSA to start to consider how students can access these services via themselves. Because music increasingly is important, from Spotify all the way down to YouTube music. And there are other slight changes there. The differences between the type of subscription services that men, women would use may not be that surprising, but it indicates that the idea of subscription service is beginning to become something again, which is at the heart of how these students actually connect and live their lives. So this is very much an overview, a quick flyby, if you will. But it's fair to say that from the themes we're seeing, that the numbers of applicants are going to grow over the medium term, more from the UK and more international. Demand distribution isn't even, however, and there are shifts actually in the movement of student populations based on the desirability of location, of maybe strong city or university brands. The students' experience of the pandemic did vary depending on their accommodation. It was better in the PBSA, it was far worse in the private rented sector. And the benefits of high quality, purpose built accommodation, centralized management did come to the fore during the pandemic. Those organizations that could respond to the pandemic quickly and support the students have clearly done well in the minds of the students, who are confident and happy to share that experience with others. And connectivity and culture. Yes, it's always been the case that that's what university was for, but I think now we're seeing more of a need for accommodation providers to recognize that this is an integral way that students live, and that added value benefits around faster Wi-Fi services and a more connected way of living within the accommodation that's offered would make definitely a strong case for students to start to consider one type of accommodation over another, so long as, of course, it's good quality and value for money. They want to be connected digitally to friends and family away from university, but they also want to be connected physically with others within the environment, using social space and being able to meet and actually have the student experience that, as our quote said, really drives the vibe as well as the course. And it is worth saying that somewhere out there will be a change to the admission system that will require us all to be conscious of what's going to happen in the future in terms of the application timetable. That's something perhaps for another day.
And we're back in the room. So thank you, Mike. Thanks for taking the time to do the pre-record and some really interesting insight there. And we have a number of questions that have come through, which is great. I'll get to those in a second. I would also encourage any additional questions at this point in time. So some quite startling numbers, actually. So 500,000 placed applicants and 50,000 placed through clearing. I mean, they are big numbers, aren't they, to be honest? So, and interesting that the key themes remain the same, and are those traditional ones that we always go back to, I guess. So, and the piece around connections are key, is a really interesting point as well, actually. So, and one that's played out for me personally, actually. So my eldest started uni back in September, and things have clearly moved on a significant amount since I was there, because actually, not only has he managed to figure out who he's living with, who's on his course, he's always also find himself a girlfriend via Zoom and before he even started, which is pretty phenomenal, to be honest. So, yeah, it just plays to what you've said. So, we had a session earlier with Dr. Alexis Brown from HEPI, and we talked about many things, but we also talked specifically about the challenge of sort of crystal ball gazing, I guess. And it's difficult to get away from that when we're talking about data and insight. So, are you getting any sense, or do you have a sense that in a post-COVID world there'll be differing requirements in terms of particular room types? Are we getting any sense that there might be an increased requirement for ensuite over sort of more traditional offer? Is that level of detail not coming through yet?
So the one of the things that's always struck me about this is there is a consistency, as you've just pointed out, about this student experience. It's evident that the real drive is to go away and experience life and live it in that way. There are also some real standards, and the increase in the number of students that are looking for ensuite accommodation has always struck me as odd. It took me a very long time to find a house which has got an ensuite bathroom, and yet all of these students seem to see this as something they would like straight away. But I think the idea of communal living and the support that that offered through the last 18 months or so has proven its worth. The students recognised that they had to deal with a difficult situation, and I make no apologies, particularly around focusing on COVID. It's been the one driving influencer in the sector this last few years. And I think those that found they were being supported actually saw the value in it, as we indicated in the research. It was reflected in that way. So yes, there are standard requirements. They are really looking for value for money. Quality is really important. And yes, the room types, whilst there has occasionally been a small blip, so studio apartments suddenly seem to be more attractive to international students, which makes sense. They come further, they want to possibly live more independently. That's not really seeing huge shifts in the analysis we do on accommodation search. It's broadly pretty much the same, and the factors and the things that concern students are all also pretty standard as well.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. I guess there is a potential, I suppose, that if we are seeing less international students, certainly in the short term, that those institutions that have a high proportion of studios as part of their portfolio may hit some potentially challenging times in respect of selling those, because they're actually not fishing in the same pool necessarily as they would have been in recent years.
Yes, I mean, I think they obviously suit some people. The models that we have to apply to the accommodation sector need to flex in terms of demand. I think the one thing I'd be hopefully making clear is that demand is definitely going to continue to rise. That all providers of accommodation and all providers of higher education, I think, can be pretty confident that there's a strong and secure market well into the future, at least into the midterm. We an accommodation portal ourselves at UCAS, we've seen a sevenfold increase in the number of people that are using that to try and identify where accommodation is. And over a quarter of a million in the last 6 months have come and had a look. So the desire for accommodation, looking out for that and what they might be able to afford is going to remain a constant. We're not going to see, as some people feared when the demographics were going in the wrong way, a collapse in student numbers, even if the potential requirements and attractions of apprenticeship draw many younger 18, 19-year-olds away from higher education. And we're seeing a growth in that as well, incidentally. That's still not going to impact significantly on the numbers that will seek to apply. So yes, I think all of the providers might need to cut the model slightly differently. Perhaps some of those accommodation options they had that were being taken by international students or possibly older students are now going to need to be revisited. But I don't see that there'll be a lack of people who would take some of it up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just about finding the sweet spot in terms of rate specifically, I guess, isn't it? So,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
We have a question from Robert Garnish, actually. So have you picked up any meaningful insight from students about the challenges of insufficient capacity as it stands in student accommodation marketplaces? So Robert's saying that it's been a significant challenge in Glasgow, particularly this year, with sort of increases in A-level and higher grades resulting in larger intakes, and it shows no signs of going away in that market particularly.
Yes, well, he's right. There are particular pinch points, and we have seen in some cities a very real problem in terms of there being currently enough accommodation available. It's being built, it's being planned. If you go to Bristol, if you go to Nottingham, if you go to more or less any large city, you'll see large blocks of accommodation being built. The problem is a lot of this hasn't been able to come on stream in time to meet the needs for students, and there are various cases of cities or providers being unable to deliver that accommodation as promised. And also there has been an issue, again not for today, but the teacher assessed grades, what's gone on in terms of application and acceptance into university has caused also some difficulties. We've moved slightly away from a more conventional system that we were probably all used to, with exams and grades and everything being managed in that way. So the last couple of years have thrown a number of difficult scenarios that have had to be faced. We know that cities, and I described, I think, there in the presentation, this idea of strong brands that attract students. Certain cities are facing a real problem when it comes to having enough accommodation. It's there and it's being built, but there are definitely timing issues with that.
Okay, that's great. Picking up on that point, actually, in terms of this sort of strong city or strong university brand, I'm not sure how best to position this actually, because I might end up upsetting some colleagues. So, are there any particular cities that are being drawn out of that insight where there's some sort of indication that actually that there may be an emerging issue in terms of attraction for us to a city?
Well, I mean, we've seen that city searches tend to reflect very often student demand in terms of looking for places, i.e., where courses are particularly strong. But all of the usual suspects are there. So we have a top 10 is currently London. Glancing at some notes: London, Birmingham, Glasgow, Manchester, Bristol, Leeds. You know, there's your top few cities where we know we're seeing an increase in the level of interest to find accommodation. Students also operate and deliver in sort of different ways depending upon the types of course they're applying for. We see peaks and troughs in terms of the search for accommodation. So I think that when it comes to trends, yes, we know migration internally is happening. And again, I called out the fact that those universities and city towns in the west of England and the west of the country, I should say, have certainly seen some changes to their benefit, less so to the east. But it hasn't, for example, diminished London's attraction for many students, even though London, if you like, is a net exporter of students rather than importer of 18-year-olds. But yeah, it balances out.
Excellent, thank you. Is your insight telling you that there's any difference between what FE students think they want, and then once they're there with the benefit of hindsight, what they then realise is most important?
Well, I haven't seen anything specifically, although I know anecdotally that the concept of value for money, which keeps coming up, is probably the one thing where students become challenged. There have been reports that students have believed that they were being placed into particular types of accommodation that they'd only been able to see virtually, and yet when they arrive, they're told that either isn't available or it's completely different. So I think that's a sort of a standard danger of anybody that's seeing something at distance and remotely. But obviously, it has a slightly more piquancy for students who are leaving possibly for the first time, moving to a city that they don't know, think that they know where they're going, having seen it through the online environment, and suddenly discover that it isn't where they are. It isn't useful for the sector, and it's not useful for the universities themselves to have reports of students literally living in other towns from the one in which they believe they were going to be staying and studying.
Yeah, and you can understand why they would be upset and perplexed by that, to be honest. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talked a little bit around insight in terms of students' reflections on PBSA in particular's reaction to COVID and processes that were implemented to keep people safe and so on and so forth. And hindsight's a wonderful thing, but could you draw anything out from that research which would suggest that the PBSA and all universities could have reacted quicker or responded differently to drive improved satisfaction in that regard?
I think that's very difficult. As you say, hindsight is the only exact science. I think the sector does deserve a little bit of a pat on the back for realizing that it needed to act. I would suggest some acted more quickly and possibly with more effect than others. But I believe overall, again, as borne out from the analysis that we've shared there in the surveys, that those that were in PBSAs that were well organized and that were managed properly, they actually had, yes, a bad, but a least worst bad experience than others. Those students that were actually in the private sector, they are the cohort that were really struggling. So I think there are lessons. Yes, I think that speed of response is always key in these types of things. But overall, had I seen numbers that said, only 30% of students felt that their PBSA had done well, we would have been having an entirely different A, conversation now, and B, the sector itself would have reflected differently. As it was, most students that were there seemed to believe that they were dealt with on reflection, they were dealt with well.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's good to hear. So excellent. Going back to the value for money piece, have you done any specific research around how students define value for money?
Well, in their minds, it's about quality. And I think the one thing I would flag, although I made light of it earlier, if they think they are going to go to a university and they would like some privacy and they would like therefore to have their own ensuite, etc., what they're looking for is something that is, yes, of a good standard and clean and well maintained. And I think they associate those two things straight away. So if the accommodation feels like it's modern and it's well put together, and even though the room might be slightly small when they get to see it in real life, actually it's clean and it's near to town and their experience is good, then they tend to feel happier about that than otherwise. But it is a slightly nebulous quality. I suppose we need to remember these are young people predominantly who are moving away very often for the first time, having to deal with managing their money, and a large percentage of that goes on their accommodation. So, whilst every circumstance is different, I think that's how they try to marry those two things up. For them, value for money means that they think what they get, obviously, is of the quality they expect.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I've been having some, again, interesting debates with my eldest in recent weeks. So he's absolutely delighted that he's got 2 hours worth of face-to-face teaching
Yeah.
a week, and I'm almost apoplectic about it. So yeah, so different perceptions about what's important and what
Yes,
isn't at this.
I should probably declare initially I have three daughters who are all just finishing at various degrees, either starting first job post university or PGCE or in gap year. And yes, it's been interesting to reflect upon their experiences over the last few years, and actually mirrors quite a lot of what we see. from the accommodation surveys we run, from the work we do with Frank Knight, it's quite evident that there are main themes that actually remain true within that student body.
Apologies, I had to dash away. I've said it a few times. I'm in a room with a PIR and it keeps going off, so I end up sitting in the dark. So
I just thought I'd driven you to distraction there, Phil. I'm sorry.
not in the slightest. So, I think probably final question actually, and again we've talked about it a little bit, but from a capacity perspective. So you've indicated demand. We're anticipating demand is going to continue to rise. We're seeing PBSA and universities investing in stock, so on and so forth. Maybe there's probably a short-term issue as stuff has sort of ground to a halt to an extent during COVID. But are you anticipating broadly that over the course of the next, I don't know, 3, 5, 8 years that increased demand will be met by increased capacity, or do you anticipate there'll be some other additional pinch points?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that if you are a provider of good quality student accommodation in a main city with a university that's already attracting a load of applications and applicants, you will be finding the demand will outstrip probably what you can supply for some considerable time. We can't see entirely what will happen. We know that the UK all applicant UK rate is going to go up. We know that it's increasing from international students. There have this year been some difficulties for many of those international students actually getting here, but that is only going to grow. And even being, I think, reasonable level of optimism, the next 5, 6 years look particularly good in terms of both the rise in demand and the corresponding supply. The issue, you've pointed it out, is this pinch point around certain schemes being finished and being made available, which unfortunately seem to reflect certain shortages and difficulties that the building trade, etc., generally is having, and that's got a knock-on effect into the university sector. But overall, I would say the situation's looking good.
That's good. That's a good place to stop, I think. So that's great. Mike, I really appreciate your time. So thank you very much. It's
My
been
pleasure.
Really insightful. So before we close the session, so again, just thanks, Mike. Much appreciated. To everybody else that has joined the call, thank you for your time and attendance today. Again, it's appreciated. Don't forget, we are continuing to push through the afternoon. No mid-afternoon lull for us. So we are going into a session at 2:30 today, which relates to the future of residence life. So please do join us for that. Keep tweeting, keep chatting, keep yourself into the discussion forum, get yourself into the meeting hub and connect with each other and connect with our partners as well. And at that point, I shall knock it on the head, say thanks to Mike again, and say see you later this afternoon to everybody else. Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.